They didn't come for him in daylight. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful religious institution in the city of Jerusalem, with the authority of Rome behind it, with temple guards at its disposal, with the backing of the ruling priestly class, chose to move under cover of darkness to arrest a single man from Galilee. They chose the night. They chose the silence of sleeping streets. They chose a moment when no crowds would witness what was about to happen. Why? What were they afraid of? What does it tell us that an arrest this carefully orchestrated required torches, weapons, a secret informant, a prearranged signal, and a garden outside the city walls, far from the eyes of pilgrims? And what does it tell us about Jesus himself, about the world he lived in, about the social forces converging on that night, that the entire thing had to be done this way? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels, not just this moment, but every scene that came before it. To understand what happened the night Jesus was betrayed, you have to first understand the city he was in. And to understand that city, you have to understand what happened to Jerusalem every year, when Passover arrived. If you find this kind of historical reconstruction meaningful, the kind that makes ancient texts breathe again, consider subscribing to the channel. This work takes time, and every person who joins makes it possible to keep going deeper. Jerusalem in the 1st century was not a large city by modern standards. In ordinary times, the population within its walls hovered somewhere between 25 and 40,000 people. But Passover was not an ordinary time. During the pilgrimage feast, that number swelled dramatically. Ancient sources speak of numbers that historians debate, but the consensus is that the city could hold somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 additional visitors during the festival week. Streets that were already narrow became nearly impassable. The lower city, packed with its multi-story insula buildings where families rented space by the room, filled past capacity. Pilgrims camped in open courtyards, on rooftops, in villages surrounding the city. Bethany, Bethphage, the slopes of the Mount of Olives. Every available surface became a sleeping place. This mattered enormously to the Roman authorities. The prefect Pontius Pilate, who normally governed from the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, made a point of coming to Jerusalem during Passover. He brought reinforcements with him, additional cohorts stationed at the Antonia fortress, which loomed over the northern edge of the Temple Mount, precisely so that soldiers could look down into the outer courts and respond immediately if anything broke out below. The Romans had learned, through hard experience, that Jerusalem during Passover was the single most volatile moment in the Judean calendar. This was a festival commemorating liberation from oppression. It was a festival of national identity and divine deliverance. For a people living under foreign military occupation, every Passover carried within it the compressed weight of longing for a Messiah, for a sign, for something to break. The priests who governed the temple knew this. The high priest Caiaphas, who had held his position for nearly 2 decades by this point, a remarkable tenure made possible only by his careful navigation of both Roman expectations and popular religious authority, understood the mathematics of the situation with perfect clarity. Any disruption during Passover was not simply a religious problem. It was a political crisis with potentially catastrophic consequences. If the crowd ignited, Rome would respond. And Rome's response to unrest in subject territories was not measured or negotiated. It was swift, brutal, and collective. Caiaphas had seen what happened when Jerusalem became ungovernable. He intended to prevent it. And then, 5 days before Passover, a man from Galilee entered the city on a donkey, while crowds laid branches and cloaks on the road before him, and shouted words drawn directly from the royal psalms. From the temple authorities' perspective, This was not a religious curiosity. It was a spark in a room full of dried wood. The city Jesus entered that week was organized, in almost every physical detail, around the logic of ritual purity and economic hierarchy. If you walked into Jerusalem from the east, crossing the Kidron Valley, climbing through the gates, you would move through layers of the city that corresponded, almost architecturally, to your place in the social order. The wealthy priestly families lived in the upper city, on the western hill, in houses whose excavated remains still astonish archaeologists today. Homes with multiple mikvot, the ritual immersion pools required for purification, with frescoed walls, imported stone vessels, mosaic floors. These were not modest dwellings. These were the homes of people who understood that proximity to the temple meant proximity to power, and that power, in Jerusalem, translated directly into material wealth. Below them, in every sense, lived everyone else. The lower city was dense, loud, and perpetually in motion. Narrow lanes cut between buildings that rose 2 and 3 stories, their outer walls of rough limestone darkened by years of cooking smoke and human contact. The smell of the city in Passover week would have been overwhelming to modern sensibilities. Animals brought for sacrifice, their dung and blood absorbed into the limestone of the streets, the smoke of the altar fires drifting over the walls, the sweat of tens of thousands of bodies in close proximity, the sharp tang of hyssop and cedar used in purification rites. Sound carried everywhere. Aramaic, spoken in the Galilean dialect, would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who heard it. Regional accents in first-century Judea were distinct enough that they served as social markers, instant identifiers of where a person came from, and, by extension, what kind of person they were. Jesus and his disciples were unmistakably Galilean. This was not a trivial detail. Galileans occupied an ambiguous position in the social geography of Judean religious life. Galilee had a complex history. It had been repopulated with Jewish settlers only a few generations before Jesus' birth, and it sat at the crossroads of trade routes that brought constant contact with Gentile culture. Judean religious authorities in Jerusalem sometimes regarded Galileans with a mixture of condescension and suspicion. Pious enough, perhaps, but rough around the edges, not quite fully formed. The question posed in the Gospel of John, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" was not invented for dramatic effect. It reflected a genuine social attitude. The disciples gathered in Jerusalem that week were men who would have felt this dynamic in every interaction. They were pilgrims, not residents. They had no property in the city, no established households, no network of social obligations that would have granted them the informal protections that belonging to a community provides. They were, in the most precise sense, outsiders, welcomed for the festival, tolerated for the week, but rooted nowhere within those walls. The room where they shared the Passover meal together was borrowed. This detail appears in the synoptic accounts almost as an aside. Jesus instructs 2 disciples to follow a man carrying a water jar, who will lead them to a householder who has a large upper room available. The logistics are described with a precision that suggests advance arrangement, possibly a contact within the city who could provide space without drawing attention. But the underlying social reality is significant. On the most sacred night of the Jewish calendar, the night of the Passover Seder, Jesus and the 12 gathered not in a home that belonged to any of them, not in a space they could call their own, but in a room that someone else had agreed to lend. Everything about their position in Jerusalem that week was provisional, temporary, dependent on the hospitality of others. And Judas Iscariot knew this. Whatever the deeper motivations behind what Judas did, and the gospel accounts do not give us a simple answer, offering instead a convergence of disappointment, financial arrangement, and something described in the language of spiritual surrender. What Judas provided to the temple authorities was operationally specific. He did not simply confirm that Jesus was in Jerusalem. They could see that. He did not identify Jesus by face. Jesus was already publicly known after days of teaching in the temple courts. What Judas provided was timing and location. He knew where Jesus would be on a specific night, away from the crowds, in a place where an arrest could be made quietly. The garden called Gethsemane, on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives, just across the Kidron Valley from the eastern wall of the city. Jesus apparently used this place regularly. Luke tells us that it was his custom to go there. It was outside the city walls, which during Passover week would have been important. The density inside Jerusalem was such that private conversation was nearly impossible. The garden offered something the city could not: space, relative quiet, the ability to breathe. Olive trees planted close together, their thick, gnarled trunks providing shadow even in moonlight. The ground between them would have been soft with fallen leaves, the air carrying the faint bitterness of olive oil from the press that gave the place its name. Gat Shemanim, the oil press. It was to this place, after the meal, that Jesus led his disciples, and it was to this place that Judas, having left the meal early, led the arresting party. The arresting party that came into the garden that night was not a small group. The Gospel of John uses a specific Greek word, spera, to describe part of the force that accompanied Judas. The word refers to a Roman military cohort, or at minimum, a detachment of one. Combined with the temple guards sent by the chief priests and Pharisees, what entered Gethsemane that night was a coordinated deployment involving both Roman military presence and the Jewish temple police. They came, the text tells us, carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Pause on that image for a moment. Torches and lanterns. On a night when the Passover moon, the 14th of Nisan, always fell on or near the full moon, would have been bright enough to cast shadows. They brought artificial light into a night already lit by one of the brightest moons of the year. The detail is not incidental. A full moon meant that anyone moving through the garden would be visible. Torches meant something else entirely. They meant that this group intended to be seen. They were not attempting stealth once they arrived. The stealth had already been accomplished by Judas, who knew the place and had guided them there. The torches were for control, for intimidation, for the projection of overwhelming force into a space where 11 frightened men from Galilee and their teacher were gathered among the olive trees. This was a show of power designed to prevent resistance. And yet something unexpected happened when they arrived. The accounts describe a moment of strange, almost inexplicable stillness. Jesus, rather than fleeing, which the darkness and the terrain of the Kidron Valley would have made entirely possible, walked toward them. He asked whom they were seeking. When they answered, he identified himself. And the text of John's Gospel records something that has puzzled readers for centuries. The crowd drew back and fell to the ground. Whatever the precise nature of that moment, the effect on the narrative is jarring. An armed detachment, confident enough to move against a man during the most crowded week in Jerusalem's calendar, suddenly falters at a simple self-identification. The initiative, briefly, shifts. And Jesus uses that shift not to escape, but to negotiate a specific condition. Let these men go, meaning his disciples, meaning the 11 who stood behind him in the dark. This was not a man who did not understand what was happening to him. The disciples, for their part, reacted as men react when fear overrides deliberation. Peter drew a blade, a short sword, the kind a man might carry for protection on the roads, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. The man's name, John tells us, was Malchus. This detail, a name preserved across decades of oral tradition, specific enough to suggest that Malchus was known to at least some of the early Christian community, grounds the violence in the particular. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was a real man, bleeding in a garden in the middle of a night that was already fracturing into chaos. Jesus stopped it. His response to Peter's action has the quality of someone who has thought through this moment already, who understands not just its immediate consequences, but its meaning within a much larger frame. Put the sword away. Those who live by it will die by it. Do you think I cannot ask my Father for legions of angels? But how then would the Scriptures be fulfilled? There is an entire world compressed into that question. Not the despair of a man who has run out of options, but the deliberate choice of a man who has considered the options and declined them. What happened next unfolded with the mechanical inevitability of a process already set in motion. Jesus was bound, the binding itself a significant act, the physical marking of a change in legal status from free person to prisoner, and led back across the Kidron Valley, through the city gates, into Jerusalem. The disciples scattered. Mark's Gospel preserves a strange, almost embarrassing detail at this point. A young man who had been following the group was grabbed by the arresting party and fled naked into the night, leaving his linen cloth behind in their hands. The detail is so specific, so unheroic, that it has the unmistakable quality of something actually remembered. Someone was there who ran. Someone remembered running. The 11 who had promised, hours earlier, that they would never abandon him. All of them were gone. Jesus was alone. The path from Gethsemane led first to the house of Annas, the former high priest and father-in-law of Caiaphas, who still wielded enormous informal authority within the priestly establishment. This preliminary interrogation, conducted in the middle of the night in a private residence, without the formal procedures that Jewish law prescribed for criminal trials, tells us something important about the nature of what was happening. This was not, at this stage, a legal proceeding. It was an assessment. Annas was determining what they had, what Jesus would say for himself, what charges could be made to stick when the formal process began. Jesus, when asked about his disciples and his teaching, gave an answer that was both precise and deliberately provocative. He had spoken openly in the synagogues and the temple, where all could hear. Why ask him? Ask those who heard him. One of the guards standing nearby struck him across the face for the response. Jesus' reply to the blow. Is that any way to respond to someone who has spoken truthfully? Carried within it something that looked, in that moment, nothing like defeat. Outside, in the courtyard, Peter had followed at a distance. He had come back, or perhaps had never fully fled, had circled back into the danger zone, drawn by something stronger than his fear, though not quite strong enough to overcome it. He stood warming himself by a charcoal fire in the pre-dawn cold, with the servants and guards of the high priest's household. It was the fire that betrayed him. Firelight does what moonlight cannot. It illuminates faces, and a servant girl, looking at the face of this man warming his hands in the courtyard of the high priest at an hour when no innocent pilgrim would have any reason to be there, recognized him as one of them. 3 times, in the space of what could not have been more than an hour, Peter denied knowing Jesus. The 3rd denial was still on his lips when, somewhere in the complex of buildings around him, a rooster announced the end of the night. And Peter, the text says, went out and wept bitterly. Dawn came to Jerusalem the way it always came during Passover week, gradually, and then all at once. The city that woke around Jesus' trial was already in motion before full light reached the streets. Pilgrims rose early for morning prayers. Merchants opened their stalls in the lower market. The smell of bread baking in clay ovens drifted through the limestone lanes. Somewhere in the temple courts, the morning Tamid sacrifice was being prepared, the daily burnt offering that marked the official beginning of the day's liturgical activity, the ancient rhythm that continued regardless of what was happening in the rooms of power above it. The world did not stop for what was about to happen. This is one of the most important things to understand about the trial and execution of Jesus. It happened inside an ordinary day. The pilgrims cooking their morning meals did not know. The merchants arranging their goods did not know. The priests performing their liturgical duties in the inner courts were simultaneously, in the outer administrative chambers of the priestly establishment, processing a capital case against a Galilean teacher. The two realities existed in the same physical space, separated only by walls and the accident of proximity. The formal session of the Sanhedrin, or at minimum, a council convened from among its senior members, since serious questions remain among historians about the precise legal nature of the gathering, took place in the early morning hours, after the informal interrogation before Annas. The speed of the entire process was itself a kind of statement. From arrest in the garden to formal condemnation, the elapsed time was a matter of hours. Jewish legal tradition prescribed careful procedures for capital cases. They were to be tried during the day. Verdicts were not to be rendered on the same day as testimony was heard. 2 witnesses were required, and their testimonies had to agree in every detail. Whether all of these protections were observed that morning is something the Gospel accounts render ambiguous. Deliberately so, perhaps, since what they emphasize is not procedural irregularity, but the underlying dynamic. A decision had already been made, and the formal process was being used to ratify it. Witnesses were brought forward. Their testimonies, the accounts tell us, did not agree. Eventually, the high priest stood and asked Jesus directly, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" What Jesus said in response to that question, the precise wording varies between the synoptic accounts, moving between unambiguous affirmation in Mark and more qualified formulations in Matthew and Luke, was received in the room as blasphemy. Caiaphas tore his garments. The council condemned him as deserving death. The tearing of garments was not theater. It was a prescribed physical response to the hearing of blasphemy, a ritual action that simultaneously expressed horror and served a legal function, marking the moment of transgression for any subsequent proceedings. Caiaphas knew exactly what he was doing. Every gesture in that room was calibrated. But the council had a problem that no amount of ritual precision could resolve. Under Roman occupation, the Jewish authorities had lost the right of capital punishment. The power to execute, the ius gladii, the right of the sword, resided exclusively with Rome. Whatever verdict the council reached, it could not be carried out without Roman authorization. That meant Pontius Pilate. That meant crossing the city in the early morning, approaching the Praetorium, likely Herod's palace on the western edge of the upper city, though the Antonia fortress remains an alternative, and presenting the case to a prefect who had no particular interest in Jewish theological disputes and every interest in maintaining public order during the most volatile week of the year. The priests who arrived at Pilate's door that morning would not enter the Praetorium itself. To enter a Gentile building during Passover week risked contracting ritual impurity that would have prevented them from eating the festival meal. And so Pilate, in a detail that carries an almost unbearable irony, came out to them. The representative of Roman imperial power came out onto the steps of his own residence to speak with the men who had brought him a prisoner, because they were unwilling to step across his threshold during a religious festival. The conversation that followed between Pilate and the council, and then between Pilate and Jesus, is preserved in accounts that each emphasize different aspects of the encounter. But across all of them, a consistent picture emerges. Pilate found no basis for a capital charge in Roman law. The religious offense that the council had identified, blasphemy, claiming divine status, was not a crime under Roman jurisdiction. To secure the execution they required, the charge had to be translated into the language of Roman political concern, and so it was reframed. This man claims to be the King of the Jews. In Roman terms, that was a claim to political authority that superseded Caesar's. That was sedition. That was a matter for Roman justice. Whether Pilate was genuinely reluctant, as the Gospel accounts suggest, or whether he understood immediately what was being asked and the political calculus behind it, is something history cannot resolve with certainty. What is certain is the outcome. Somewhere in the space of that morning, after the interrogation, after the episode involving Barabbas, after Pilate's public gesture of washing his hands before the crowd, the order was given. And here is where the entire night, the entire architecture of fear and calculation that had produced this moment, collapses into something that no political analysis can fully contain. Because when Jesus stood before Pilate, he was not acting like a man whose movement had failed. He was not acting like a prophet whose predictions had proven wrong. He answered questions with a precision that suggested complete awareness of what each answer would cost him. He maintained, in the face of the most coercive power available in that world, a coherence of self that the entire apparatus arrayed against him could not fracture. Pilate asked him directly, "Don't you hear how many things they are testifying against you?" Jesus gave him no answer. The silence is extraordinary. Not the silence of a man who has nothing to say. The silence of a man who has already said everything that needed to be said, and who understands that this moment is not about persuasion. In the years and decades that followed, when the communities that formed around the memory of Jesus tried to make sense of what had happened that night and that morning, they reached again and again for the language of the ancient scriptures. The servant who was silent before his accusers. The shepherd struck so that the sheep would scatter. The one delivered into the hands of sinners, according to a purpose that predated the night itself. They were not imposing meaning on events after the fact. They were recognizing something they had witnessed, that the events of that night had a shape to them that exceeded the intentions of everyone who participated in them. Caiaphas had wanted to prevent a crisis. He created the event that would fracture history. Judas had wanted something. Whatever it was, the 30 pieces of silver were returned to the temple treasury within days, thrown down on the stone floor by a man who could not live with what he had done. Pilate had wanted to avoid a problem. He became, instead, permanently attached to this story, his name embedded in a creed that would be recited for centuries across every continent on earth. And Peter, who had warmed his hands at a charcoal fire in the courtyard of the high priest, while denying 3 times that he knew the man being interrogated inside, Peter would later stand before another charcoal fire in a conversation by a lake in Galilee and be asked 3 times whether he loved the one he had denied. The night of the betrayal did not end in that garden. It ended at a lakeside, in the morning, with bread and fish, and a question repeated until the denial was covered over, not erased, but answered. And a man who had run from the darkness was given something to do with what remained of his life. This is what the historical context reveals, when you sit with it long enough, that the night Jesus was betrayed was not a night when everything went wrong. It was a night when everything that had been set in motion, The fear of the powerful, the fragility of the faithful, the violence of empire, the silence of the condemned, moved toward something that none of the participants understood they were building. They thought they were ending a story. They were writing the beginning of one.